Babice is a village of a few hundred souls in the Czech Moravian highlands, the high, cold farming country halfway between Prague and Vienna. In the summer of 1951, the village school was where the state lived. The local national committee, the village's communist administration, held its meetings in the school building in the evenings, under the blackboards. On the 2nd of July 1951, around 10:30 at night, 4 men were finishing such a meeting. The school's own headmaster, who chaired the committee, his deputy, a forestry worker, the treasurer, a warehouseman of 33, a carpenter of 57. 2 armed men walked in out of the dark and ordered them into the corridor. One of the intruders asked a question. "Who is the chairman of the party?" The headmaster turned. "I am," he said. The shooting started. 3 of the 4 died in the corridor of the school, where one of them had taught the village's children for years. The 4th, shot in the back, dragged himself up the stairs and lived. The manhunt that followed lasted barely a day. The reckoning lasted 2 years, and by its end, the state had hanged 11 men for that night. Here is the first thing to know about them. One of the 11, a young village priest, had been sitting in a secret police cell for 63 days when the trigger was pulled. He was hanged as one of the crime's authors anyway. And the second thing, the man who actually carried the pistol that night called himself a captain from the West, sent across the border on a secret mission. For 70 years, Czechs have argued about who really sent him, Washington, Prague, or no one at all. To understand what a stranger's story could do to this countryside, you have to know what was being done to it. 3 years earlier, in 1948, the Communist Party had taken Czechoslovakia. By 1951, it was taking the villages. Farms that families had held for generations were being pushed into collectives. Delivery quotas were set high enough to break the ones who refused, and the men who missed them were branded the village rich, the regime's label for any farmer who owned more than it liked. Missing a quota could mean prison. The church was being taken apart with the same patience. Monasteries had been emptied in the night. The Archbishop of Prague, Josef Beran, had vanished into internment, held without trial, his name spoken in the villages like the name of a captive king. In Babice itself, the parish had already lost 1 priest to the police before his successor ever arrived. Religion lessons still ran in the schools for now. Everyone understood they were being counted. The Highlands took all of this the way high country takes weather. Quietly, and without forgetting. It was a landscape of stone farmhouses and Sunday obligation, where the priest and the teacher were the 2 men everyone knew, and where the new state was something that arrived from elsewhere, in a car, with a list. Into this country, in the last week of February 1951, walked a man with a beard, a pistol, and a story. On the 25th of February 1951, the priest of Rokytnica, a market village a few kilometers from Babice, heard a knock at his rectory door. Jan Bula was 30, a railway worker's son, the kind of young priest the countryside produces once in a generation. He ran the youth club, staged amateur plays, and the village children followed him around. The man at the door was Ladislav Mali. They had sat in the same gymnasium classroom for 4 years. The old classmate said he was now a police officer. By the next day, the story had changed into something much bigger. Mali told Bula, in confidence, the kind of secret that stops a believer's breath. He had come from the West, working against the regime. He had already freed Archbishop Beron from internment and was hiding him nearby, moving him toward the border. And before the dangerous crossing, the Archbishop needed what any Catholic in danger of death needs: a trustworthy priest to hear his confession. Would Bula be that priest? For a young man who had watched the church being strangled for 3 years, it was everything at once: the rescue of the captive shepherd and a part in it written just for him. Bula was taken in at first. Then he began to notice things: the mission that never quite happened, the evasions, the visitor's appetite for alcohol, noted later, even in the files. Bula confided in an older priest nearby, Jan Podveski, and got a cold answer: be careful. This may be a provocateur, a man sent to trap you. At the end of April, Bula closed his door to his classmate for good. But he did not report him. A priest does not hand a man to the secret police on suspicion, and in that decent, ordinary decision, his death was already written. 2 days later, on the 30th of April, the police came for Bula. They took him out of a religion lesson in front of the children. Maley stayed loose, and the story kept working. Through the spring of 1951, the captain from the West built himself a resistance: a 20-year-old romantic named Drahoslav Nemek, the Plišta farm in Sebkovice, the father, Antonin, a respected farmer who had hidden Czechoslovak paratroopers dropped from England during the Nazi occupation, and his teenage sons, Antonin and Stanislav. A young farmer named Antonin Mitiska, facing jail over impossible delivery quotas, recruited with a line the historians would later dig out of the files: "They will lock you up anyway, so come with me." 2 gamekeepers, a hiding pit dug under a beehive shed. What did this resistance do? It moved at night, paying armed visits to communist functionaries in the surrounding villages, with warnings and sometimes with shots. The targets were not all the captain's choices. Some names came from the local men themselves, farmers settling 3 years of scores. The group stole for supplies and waited for a war everyone believed was coming. And one by one, the people around it began disappearing into police cars. Nemek got frightened, went home, was arrested. A couple who had known of the captain's visits, arrested. The priest who had refused, arrested. The men who met the captain kept falling. The captain kept moving. In May, Marley walked the same legend into Babice itself, to Father Václav Drbola, a farmer's son of 38 administering the parish. The Archbishop, the confession, the border. Drbola, warned like Bula and torn like Bula, agreed at least to help hear the hidden man's confession, and with that, he too was compromised in the only sense that mattered. He had met the visitor and not reported him. On the 17th of June, 15 days before the murders, the state security, the secret police Czechs called the STB, arrested Drbola. The raid on the school would present itself as revenge for exactly that arrest. There was one more rectory. At the end of June, Mitiska brought the captain to Father František Parel in Horní Újezd, his own parish priest, a restless farmer's son of 40. The group stayed under his roof for 3 days. Parel did not want them there, and he did not denounce them the same fatal middle path. When they left, he gave them rosaries and a blessing. 41 days later, that blessing would be read out in a courtroom as the sacrament of a terror organization. The 2nd of July was a Monday. In the Babice school that evening sat 4 men of the National Committee. Tomas Kuchtik, 53, the headmaster, chairman of both the committee and the village party cell. Joseph Rupek, 38, his deputy, a forestry worker. Bohumir Netolika, 33, the treasurer, a warehouseman. And František Blaha, 57, a carpenter. Around 10:30, Ladislav Mali came through the door with a pistol, Mitiska behind him with a submachine gun. The Plichter boys stood watch outside in the dark. What happened next exists in two versions, and both come out of the machinery that followed. The account extracted from Mitiska's interrogation says the men were ordered into the corridor with their hands up, that Mali demanded to know who had informed on the priest, on Derbola, arrested 2 weeks before, that he asked who chaired the party, that Kuchtik turned and said, "I am," and that Mali shot him, shot Rupek and Netolika from behind, then screamed at Mitiska to fire. The survivor, Blaha, told a different story once, privately, to the friend who kept the village chronicle. Netolika pulled a revolver from his pocket and everything detonated from there. Perhaps, in that telling, no one had walked in meaning to kill at all. Blaha ran for the stairwell with a bullet in his back and made it. The killers vanished into the fields. And here is a fact to hold on to, planted now, explained later. No one ever matched the guns to the wounds. No ballistic examination was ever carried out. Who fired which of the fatal shots was a question the investigation never asked, because the investigation, from its first hour, was not that kind of investigation. The 3 dead men were real, and it matters to say so plainly, because for 70 years they have been used, first by one side, then by the other. A teacher who ran the village school, a forester, a young storekeeper with a family, whose funeral, the record notes, included a requiem mass because the party's men in Babice were also, most of them, believers. Decades later, a mayor of Babice would say it simply, they were good people, and they did not deserve such a thing. Here the story does something no thriller would allow. The killers did not run for the border, though the border was the one direction the captain from the west should have known well. They walked 2 kilometers into a wheat field near the hamlet of Bolikovice and lay down in the grain. The question of why, like so much in this case, has never been answered. Perhaps they believed the captain had a plan. Perhaps the captain believed it himself. The state's response was everything its response to the captain had never been. The father, Antonin Plichter, was arrested that same morning, and one account holds that under interrogation he gave up the hiding place. By the afternoon of the 3rd of July, a police spotter aircraft was sweeping the ripening fields, and it found the pattern in the wheat. The field was surrounded, and the shooting began. When it stopped, Ladislav Mali was dead in the grain, and so was Antonin Plichter Jr., 19 years old. His brother Stanislav, also 19, had been shot twice by the spine and lay paralyzed among the stalks. Antonin Mitiska stood up with his hands raised, essentially unharmed, and it fell to him, the accomplice, to look down at a bearded corpse and confirm for the police that this was the captain. Within 24 hours of the first shot in the school corridor, every gun in the case was silent. The case itself was just beginning. The machine that now started up did not behave like a state improvising after a shock. It behaved like a state that had been waiting. Day 4. A state funeral, the Minister of Information himself speaking over the 3 coffins. Day 9. The murders invoked in Parliament to push through a new law on guarding the borders. Day 10. The trial. Not in a courtroom, In the Great Hall of the Workers' House in Jihlava, the regional capital, the murder weapons arranged on display, newsreel cameras rolling, editors of the party daily embedded beside the court to coordinate the coverage. 14 defendants stood in that hall. Mitiska and the captured farmers, but also men who had never stood in that corridor, and 2 priests. Václav Drbola, arrested 15 days before the murders, was now cast as the killer's spiritual instigator. A confession to that effect had been extracted in the meantime by methods the files record, among them clamps tightened on his fingers until the swollen flesh burst. František Parel, the priest of the Rosaries, was charged as a willing planner of further murders, a role that exists only in the interrogation protocols. Defendants recited answers memorized from those protocols. More than 600 resolutions from factories and farms demanding death reached the court before and during the hearing. The verdicts were not in doubt. Neither was the schedule. 7 coffins were delivered to Jihlava the day before the sentences were read. One of the judges confirmed it himself on television half a century later. 7 death sentences. The appeals were disposed of in 18 days. The president rejected clemency, and on the 3rd of August 1951, in the courtyard of the Jihlava prison, beginning after 4 in the morning, 7 men were hanged one after another. Mitiska, who fired. The farmer Plichta, 57, hanged as the group's ideological leader, while one son lay in a grave and the other in a prison hospital. Drahoslav Nemek, 20, who had run away from the group weeks before the murders. A gamekeeper, a smallholder, and the 2 priests. From the school corridor to the gallows, 32 days. The bodies were cremated in Brno the same day, the ashes ordered into an anonymous common grave because the state understood exactly what relics are. It did not get them all. The director of the crematorium quietly kept urns back in his basement, and there they waited, hidden, for 17 years. Remember the urns. They return at the end of this story. The first trial was only the template. In November 1951, the state came for Jan Bula, the classmate who had refused. His trial was staged in the town cinema in Trebek. 400 seats, for which the party printed 1,200 admission tickets and rotated the audiences shift by shift. By then, Bula had been made ready. Back in June, an interrogator whose name the files preserve, Antonin Akilis, had knocked out his front teeth with a knuckle duster. When Bula's mother was allowed a visit, she read what had been done to him from the swollen veins on his hands. He had signed what was put in front of him. The court's logic, reduced to its bones by the historians who later studied it. He had failed to denounce his classmate. Therefore, he was the terror's secret author. Death for high treason. They hanged him in Jihlava on the 20th of May 1952 at 5 in the morning, and even among this case's horrors, it stands apart. A slow strangulation on a pulley, a doctor checking his heartbeat every 5 minutes, a quarter of an hour to die. He was 31. In his death cell, he had painted little pictures and traded them for cigarettes. On his last night, he wrote farewell letters that survive to this day. Weigh every step well, he had told his parishioners when the regime first came for him. We do not want to betray our nation, but neither Christ. The trials kept coming, 15 in all, some in towns the group had never entered. A miller named Yaroslav Melkus was hanged, a man the record describes as inserted into a case he had nothing to do with. A farmer named Gustav Smetana was hanged. Hold that name, because his group is a key to this whole story. More than 100 people were convicted, to more than 1,300 years of prison. And around the verdicts ran a second, quieter punishment. Wives, children, and grandmothers of the condemned were loaded onto buses, the first of them 10 days after the first verdict, and deported to state farms in the borderlands, one bag of personal necessities each. One farmer's daughter arrived, as she put it decades later, with bare sandals and the clothes on her back. Children of the convicted were barred from schools. The label Babice, the one from Babice, followed families for a lifetime, like a caste mark. The regime had a use for all of it. In the party's own documents, the Babice murders appear as the trigger for a national operation against the so-called village rich that drove some 2,000 farming families from their land. The countryside got the message the corpses had been made to carry. Czech writers, groping for a comparison, reached for the darkest one the language holds: the Red Heydrichiad, an echo of the Nazi terror that followed the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich 9 years earlier, when whole villages paid for one act of violence. This time, the reprisals wore judicial robes. The last to die was the paralyzed boy. Stanislav Plichta, shot through the spine in the wheat field at 19, was kept alive in custody for 22 months so that he could be tried. In February 1953, a court in Prague sentenced him to death, and in May 1953, at Pankrak prison, he was hanged, aged 21. The accounts that came out of Pankrak say he was brought to the gallows in a wheelchair, and that his last words were, "They are hanging a beggar, mommy." With him, the count reached 11. 11 hanged, for 3 murders committed by 2 gunmen, one of whom had been dead in the wheat since the second day. So, who was Ladislav Mali? Strip away the legend and open the file, and the captain from the West becomes a different man. Born in 1920 in Slovakia, a police commander's son, 4 years of gymnasium in a shared classroom with Jan Bula, then a military school because his father wanted an officer in the family. In September 1940, the 20-year-old volunteered for the Protectorate's government army, the small force the Nazi occupiers allowed their puppet state to keep. On the 14th of November 1940, he swore its oath, an oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Within a year, the army discharged him as unfit, with drunkenness in his record. In 5 years of war and occupation, not one act of resistance. The post-war years read like a slow fall. A clerk's desk, a rejected officer application, a transfer decree torn up in anger, an accountant's job at a mountain spa, where in 1949 he assaulted the union chairman and threatened, witnesses said, to hang people from the trees. A marriage with 2 small children, collapsing. In 1949, he fled into Austria, and there the legend touches something real for the first time. The case's historians, reconstructing his exile from the files, found him working for the American Army's counterintelligence arm. Not as an officer, not as a spy, as a low-level paymaster, counting out cash for the couriers who walked the border. Then the money and the man disappeared together. When he resurfaced in the Highlands in February 1951, the dollars in his pocket by that reconstruction were the courier's stolen payroll. And the Archbishop? Joseph Beran never left internment. Not that February, not that spring, not that summer. There was no rescue, no hiding place, no confession waiting to be heard, no 6 companions from Vienna, no mission. Every detail of the story that had opened 3 rectory doors was invention, and invention of a particular genius, because it was calibrated to the one thing the regime could not confiscate from those men: their loyalty to a captive church. The lie did not select for fools. It selected for the faithful, which leaves the night of the 2nd of July stranger than before. A washed-up imposter with a stolen payroll walks into a school and executes 3 functionaries of a state he had never once fought when fighting it cost something. No Western service ever claimed him, then or since. And the state he attacked, whose secret police missed nothing in that countryside, had somehow failed for 5 months to catch a bearded fugitive who drank in rectories, stole from farms, fired guns in villages, and told his story to anyone who would listen. Out of that strangeness, even before the ropes stopped swinging, a theory began to grow. It began with the survivor. František Blaha, the carpenter who crawled up the school stairs with a bullet in his back, lived another 25 years, served the regime, in time even chaired the village committee the dead men had left behind. About the night itself, he kept a silence the village learned not to touch. To a friend once, he said the only sentence he would ever offer: "I will not lie to you, and the truth must not be spoken." He carried whatever he saw in that corridor to his grave in 1976. Where facts are sealed, stories grow. In the villages, they said Marley had been the only one who really shot, the local boys dragged into a stranger's script. They said that in the wheat field, he had turned his gun on his own men before the police ever fired. A fellow prisoner later swore to it. They said the corpse in the grain was not Marley at all, that the secret police had swapped bodies and spirited their man away. And for years, people reported seeing him alive in 1953, in 1954, somewhere in Bohemia. The priests who survived the trials believed to their deaths that the whole action had been a provocation. Podvesky, who had warned Bula about provocateurs, spent years in prison for having been right too early. The regime, strangely, kept the case alive itself. In 1975, state television dramatized Babice as an episode of its flagship propaganda crime series, Major Zeman, under the title The Murderer Hides in the Field. The village renamed, the priests written as conspirators. To this day, the single most watched piece of film about the Babice case is that episode, The Lie, in reruns half a century on. For the generation raised in the grey decades after 1968, the fiction simply was the case. Then 1989 came, the regime fell, and the whisper walked into print wearing the confidence of fact. Journalists and memoirists wrote it plainly. The secret police had staged it all. A 2008 bestseller about the case, written with the family of one of the hanged men, put it on the cover in so many words. Today, it is well known that this was a targeted provocation of state security. It seeped into documentaries, commemorations, school textbooks. For most Czechs who knew the case at all, Babice became the story of a secret police trap. There was just one problem, and it took the archives themselves to expose it. First, understand why the theory convinced a nation, because its strongest version was assembled not by conspiracy writers, but by the state's own post-communist investigators. In the 1990s, the office created to document the crimes of the communist era went through the files, and what it found reads like an indictment. From the 29th of April 1951 at the latest, the secret police knew with certainty, by name, that Ladislav Mali was the armed man behind the raids in the district. The officer's report counts what followed like a metronome. To the 2nd of July, 64 days remained. For 64 days, the most penetrating security apparatus in the country's history let him run. And it was not working blind. In that one small district, in the first half of 1951, the police ran a network of 37 informers. The day after the certainty date, they arrested Jan Bula. The people around Mali kept vanishing into cells while Mali himself walked free. Stranger still, in those same weeks in the same countryside, another man was recruiting farmers into an anti-communist resistance. He called himself Major Vasek. He was a serving officer of the secret police, and his resistance was a trap, built name by name. The farmers who trusted Major Vasek were tried in the Babice wave, and one of them was Gustav Smetana, the hanged man whose name you were asked to hold. A manufactured resistance provably existed in that district in that spring. It simply was not Mali's. The investigators found darker testimony still. A former policeman told them, on the record, why in his view the hunt took so long. The Soviet advisors embedded in the security apparatus favored a method from home. Not police work, he said, but the building of a network to create the conditions for what would follow. Let the fire spread until putting it out justifies everything. And within a year of the murders, a deputy prosecutor conceded in an internal review that the service had made errors in the management of Mali's group. Management errors. In a file about 3 dead men. Add the harvest, and the theory closes like a lock. The trial opened on day 10, with the coffins ordered early. The priests were in cells before the crime they were hanged for. The party's own documents call Babice the trigger for the deportation of 2,000 farming families. Who profits from a massacre? The one who had the script ready. The investigator who wrote the officer's report ended it with a question an old sergeant had put to him, and the whole case balances on it to this day. Who bears the greater guilt for Babice, Mali, or the one who let him run? And yet, 3 decades have now passed since the archives opened, and the files have been read by investigators whose mandate was to indict the old regime, by church historians building a case for martyrdom, and by academics with no stake at all. Here is what none of them has ever found: a file, a card, a payment, a report, any document at all showing that Ladislav Mali was an agent or informer of state security. The office that documented communist crimes said so itself. 30 years of open archives have made the missing evidence louder every year. In 2016, the historian Michal Stehlik, who had reconstructed the case document by document, published the finding that broke the theory's spine. Deep in the interrogation files sits a detail with an alibi's precision. The group's next planned action, an attack on functionaries in Sebkovich, was unknown to the secret police until after the arrests of the 3rd of July, when it surfaced from the captured father under interrogation. The service that supposedly wrote the play did not know the next scene. A provocation that has to torture its own script out of its actors after the premiere is not a provocation. The village legends fell one by one under the same scrutiny. Mali was not a lone gunman surrounded by hypnotized locals. Mitiska, a farmer's son of the district, also fired in that corridor, a local finger on a local trigger. The corpse swap, the sightings, the survival, memory artifacts, none of them standing up against the documents. The academic journal of the Czech Academy of Sciences gave its review of Stehlik's work a title that reads like a tombstone for a 70-year certainty. the end of the myth of secret police provocation in Babice. Even the historian closest to the martyr's cause came to describe a sick man used rather than an agent sent. But notice what the finding actually says, because this is the turn the whole case pivots on. The attack was not staged. It did not need to be. A state that has watched a violent fantasist for 64 days does not have to write his script. It only has to be ready for the day he writes his own. The provocation was not the murder. The provocation was everything after it. The pre-arrested authors, the memorized confessions, the cinema tickets, the coffins that arrived before the verdict. The secret police did not invent Ladislav Mali. They invented what he meant. So weigh the man for yourself, because after 75 years, exactly 3 readings are left standing, and the documents will not choose between them. The first, a directed provocateur whose file was destroyed or never written. Nothing found in 30 years supports it. But an absent file, its defenders answer, is exactly what a careful service would arrange. The second, he really was a Western operative, on a mission so secret it died with him. No archive, memoir or defector has ever claimed him, and the stolen payroll argues that the West's real relationship to Ladislav Mali was that of a robbery victim. The third is where current scholarship leans. A psychically ill adventurer, in the words of the case's most recent historian, a man who invented a captain because being Ladislav Mali had become unbearable, and whom state security exploited with a cynicism so total it looked, forever after, like authorship. Beneath the 3 readings, 2 questions will never close. Whose bullets killed the 3 men in the corridor? No ballistics were ever taken. The only 2 accounts came out of interrogation rooms, and the one free witness chose silence for 25 years. And the 64 days, incompetence or appetite? A security service too clumsy to catch a drunk imposter, or patient enough not to? The historians themselves end on that edge. The standard reference on the case still carries, in the 21st century, one standing sentence. All the circumstances have not been fully clarified. The myth is dead. The wound is open. Justice, when it finally moved the way glaciers move. In 1968, in the short thaw of the Prague spring, the hidden urns came out of the crematorium basement and went quietly to the families. 2 of the surviving priests were even rehabilitated before the tanks arrived and the case froze for 20 more years. After 1989, the thaw became a reckoning on paper. Rehabilitations from 1990, and by April 1996, the state had annulled every single Babice verdict. The regime's plaque came down off the school wall in the late 90s. In 1997, prosecutors charged the 2 surviving judges of the Jihlava trial. One had explained his career on that bench in a sentence worth remembering exactly. I did not want to go there. I knew it was about political trials. However, I had a 5-year-old son. He died in 2001 with the case unfinished. The other was ruled unfit, his mind gone. The interrogator who knocked out a priest's teeth was never charged. Of everyone who built the machine, the final score of convictions is 0. The church moved on a different clock toward a different court. In 1999, the Bishop of Brno formally lifted the degradations forced on the executed priests. In 2004, the diocese opened the cause of Jan Bula. Václav Drbola joined it in 2011. In 2015, the dossier went to Rome. On the 24th of October 2025, Pope Leo XIV signed the decree recognizing both men as martyrs. In March 2026, in a South Moravian village cemetery, Drbola's remains were exhumed for the coming rite. His nephew stood at the graveside and said that after everything, it felt like satisfaction. The urn a family had hidden from two regimes and reburied in secret under a relative's name was unwrapped as a relic. On the 6th of June 2026, on the exhibition grounds in Brno, more than 13,000 people stood before an altar draped in red, the colour of martyrs' blood. Cardinal Michael Czerny, the papal legate, read the apostolic letter inscribing Jan Bula and Václav Drbola among the blessed. The cardinal was born in Brno. His own family fled Czechoslovakia when he was 2, after the communists took it. It was only the second beatification ceremony ever held on Czech soil, and the first for victims of the communist era. The state's convicted murder plotters, now the Church's official martyrs, 75 years, almost to the month after the shots in the school. Their shared feast day is the 17th of June. May their example, the Cardinal preached, teach us to be truthful but not polarizing, free but not arbitrary, courageous but not proud. One absence from that altar deserves a sentence of its own. František Parel, the third hanged priest, the man of the rosaries and the 41 days, was not part of the cause, for reasons the diocese has never fully spelled out. The case's own historians have asked in print why only 2. His parish reburied him with honours in 2011. The Church says his memory deserves respect. On the day of the beatification, some of the 13,000 were surely praying for 3. In Babice today, the old school still stands. It houses the municipal office now. Where the regime's plaque hung, there is bare wall, and across the district stand newer stones. A bust of Father Drbola by the parish house, small memorial plaques on the houses of the executed, a monument in the regional capital carrying all 11 names. The village's own website keeps a page on the case with the full register of the convicted, and it says of Ladislav Mali, in its own words, that his role remains to this day the greatest mystery. Perhaps the truest thing the village keeps is the double grief. 3 men shot in a school corridor, and 11 men hanged in prison courtyards, and around them 100 broken families on both sides of a line the state drew through one July night. They were good people, the mayor said of the murdered officials, and they did not deserve such a thing. Neither did the men whose names were on the coffins that came early. 2 sets of victims, one narrative machine between them, and in the middle, forever, a carpenter on a staircase who lived 25 more years with the answer and left the country a single sentence in its place. I will not lie to you, and the truth must not be spoken. 3 weeks before this film was published, on the 2nd of July 2026, the anniversary came around for the 75th time. The historians held a conference. The diocese rang its bells for 2 new blessed, and somewhere in an archive box in Prague sits everything the files will ever say about a bearded man in a wheat field, a captain from nowhere, still keeping the one secret every investigation, every legend, and every miracle of this case has broken against, whether anyone, anywhere, ever sent him at all. This has been Eastern Files. If this story held you, the like button and a subscription genuinely decide whether cases like this one get told, and the bell means you will not miss the next file we open. Now the question 75 years could not close for you. Ladislav Mali told a village he was a captain sent from the West. The files found no one behind him, and no one who stopped him. What do you believe? A Western agent, a secret police pawn, or a man who invented himself? And those 64 days, failure or patience? Tell us below. The archive is open, and the next case is already waiting.